Hello, everyone. Wherever you are in the world, I'd like to thank you for attending this talk that's going to focus on the impacts of Scottish woodland expansion on soil organic carbon storage in our upland podzolic soils. Now, I'm going to be presenting some new data that I think are quite exciting on the subject. However, first and foremost, I'm going to start this presentation, as any good presentation should start, with a quote from a 13th century Persian poet. So, in his masterpiece, the Masnavi, the poet Rumi gave us this line: "Maybe you are searching among the branches for what only appears in the roots." Now, this may have become the phrase that launched 1,000 Tumblr posts, but I think we can also read into it a quite widespread attitude towards woodland expansion and its benefits, i.e., a focus on the visible, the trees and the carbon that they contain in their biomass, and a comparative ignorance for the invisible, those soil processes that occur below ground, out of sight, out of mind. And we can see elements of this attitude in Scottish government policy. So current policy is to accelerate woodland creation. They hit 15,000 hectares last year, and I believe they're going to hit 18,000 in the coming years. That's the target. So we're talking about approximately 1% of the total land area being converted into woodland every 5 years. And there's an assumption that this will come with a parallel increase in carbon sequestration, owing to the accumulating phytomass. And this may well be justifiable in former arable settings. We have a lot of evidence for just stopping the tillage, let alone adding trees, results in carbon gains. However, the relatively neoliberal approach to woodland expansion taken in the UK and in Scotland especially means that much of this woodland ends up where land is cheapest, and that's the economically marginal uplands. Now, these are environments in which I like to spend a lot of my time. They're dominated by these low stature ericaceous systems, we call them moorlands, where the slow accrual of phytomass belies the vast quantities of soil organic carbon stored in the underlying, often podzolic soils, both in the PT upper organic layer, where the material might be thermodynamically quite labile and vulnerable to change, and also as a result of leaching and reprecipitation in the lower alluvial horizons. And so we can kind of see soil organic carbon, well, total carbon storage in this system as analogous to the iceberg. Now, we all know that the iceberg contains 90% of its mass below the waterline. And in the same way, actually, in these systems, the figure sits at around 90% of total ecosystem carbon being below ground. And what this means is, while we understand how phytomass accumulates pretty well, this is just a fraction of the picture. Now, my colleagues have addressed this across the world, and we're beginning to see that actually, certainly in the organic layers, the expansion of woodland onto these ericaceous ecosystems may result in the destabilization of pre-existing soil organic carbon. But what about the keel of the iceberg, those deeper mineral layers, those alluvial layers that gain carbon through leaching and reprecipitation? Well, the evidence is sparse, and what limited evidence we do have tends to be based on observational chronosequence space-time studies, where the natural variation impedes our ability to extract a tree-related effect. And so we wanted to approach this a little bit differently. So within this study, our aims were to try and inventory soil organic carbon stocks in both the organic and mineral horizons. We're going to be focusing mainly on mineral today. On an experimentally established series of woodlands in northeastern Scotland. And then to use a novel technique of ramp thermal oxidation with radiocarbon analysis to understand how the long-term dynamics of soil organic matter might have changed in the same sites. And overall, we just hypothesized that net soil organic carbon losses in these organic horizons, they're well documented before, we're predicting that they might be offset by net gains in the mineral horizons based on the few studies that have looked at this. And that this would coincide with the restabilization of mobilized organic horizon material in the alluvial horizons, keeping with the common idea of the podsilization process. And so we pursued a field campaign at the MoCo experimental platform. So this is a series of sites in the northeast of Scotland, 20 to 45 years of age, where birch and or pine woodland have been planted with low impact slot planting on heather moorland. So it's a really good site for exploring tree-induced effects. And critically, these sites have been studied before by Friggins et al. 2020, wherein they found that organic horizons experience soil organic carbon losses following the establishment of these trees. So we have that result already kind of in the bag, and we know that those losses have occurred and been observed. Okay. Within each site, there are a series of plots, 3 to 6 per treatment, depending on the site. And we took each plot, divided it into 4 subplots, pursued things such as allometric biomass estimations for the canopy layer, characterization of the field and moss layers, and destructive harvests, which included taking the biomass to expose the organic surface, cutting a 15 centimeter diameter core into the organic layer with a clean bread knife, extracting and partitioning into subhorizons, before hammering from the organomineral interface a 30 by 5 centimeter diameter core into the mineral layers, extracting it and sectioning it into 10 centimeter depth increments. We also then took a subset of samples from the Balogi site only, and subjected this to ramp thermal oxidation radiocarbon analysis. So one subplot per plot was selected on the basis of median organic horizon depth, and these samples were dried and then heated gradually, and the evolved CO2 simultaneously detected, which allowed us to produce these thermograms that you see on the left of the screen. These thermograms enabled us to then select temperature fractions that seem to represent different components of organic matter. So in this case, we chose 0 to 290, 290 to 355, and 355 to 600. These were chosen not only to allow sufficient carbon to be available for analysis, but also to isolate the 2 peaks that are quite obvious in the diagrams, and also the interpeak area, because we felt like these would represent 3 distinct components that were important to the soil organic matter makeup. It also means that based on previous findings, we should be separating out something that's more polysaccharide dominated, something that might be a polysaccharide lignin mix, and then something that may be more dominated by aromatics and phenols. For each of these fractions, within the sampling design described previously, a radiocarbon content was obtained for each. Yeah. And so, in terms of findings, I think first and foremost, I just want to really quickly emphasize that we have some preliminary evidence supporting the previous findings of organic horizon soil organic carbon losses. So we've got depth data here, we've got it for different subhorizons, but we've also got it for total horizons. What you can see on the left-hand side is, in both cases, with the exception at Balogi of a single outlier, most tree organic horizons tend to be lower than those associated with heather moorland. They tend to be shallower. And at Delnaline, this effect was significant, and actually the effect of tree biomass was significant too. So it's not only the presence of trees, but also how much tree you have influences organic horizon depth. So again, we seem to be supporting previous findings that there are certainly substantial changes to the organic horizons, if not soil organic carbon losses themselves. But what about the iceberg's keel, those deeper mineral horizons we talked about? So in this case, we actually found substantial losses at Delnaline, when we included just cores that hadn't been compacted and weren't really difficult to section in some way, that effect was significant. There were around 6 cores that had suffered compaction, and this meant that we could only use the core for estimating the entire 30 centimeters, and this might have been due to high organic contents. In this case, the added variation did render the effect no longer significant. But nevertheless, in both cases at both sites, there is certainly no net soil organic carbon accumulation, and in fact we have some evidence for losses continuing at least into the 0 to 10 centimeter depth increment at Delta line. And then looking at our radiocarbon data, we found something really quite interesting. So looking at the uppermost H horizon, so this is the lowermost part of the organic horizon, we actually saw a shift, a downward shift in radiocarbon enrichment under Birch in all thermic fractions. So we interpret this as a greater incorporation of modern atmospheric carbon into this layer, and to a lesser extent, into the upmost mineral layer. And that would be consistent with enhanced turnover post-bomb, so with the establishment of these trees, which happened after the bomb peak. And then also, if we look at the lowermost layer, we see something really interesting as well, where heather seems to become quite homogenized across thermic fractions in terms of radiocarbon enrichment. The opposite appears true of Birch. So while the high thermic fraction, so the most recalcitrant material, appears to follow the same pattern in becoming more radiocarbon depleted, the lower and medium temperature fractions actually go the opposite way, and they become more enriched relative to the layer above and relative to the heather moorland counterparts. So we interpret this as subtle evidence for the remobilization and accumulation further down of bomb peak material that may have been destabilized in the organic horizons through that alluvial process. But we need to explore this further, and actually we just found out we've got extra radiocarbon dates to see if the same pattern emerges in the deeper layers, and also whether there is a similar pattern exhibited under pine. So that's really exciting. So yeah, we need to know more about whether the switchback continues. And so bringing everything together, I think when we consider the whole iceberg, we know that the biomass accumulation is what it is. We've got good evidence for that. In this study, we've confirmed previous findings that soil organic carbon losses occur from the organic horizons when birch and to a lesser extent pine establish on heather moorland. So that's excellent. But when we consider the keel of the iceberg, we find that these losses are not themselves negated by gains in the top 30 centimeters of the mineral subsoil. And this is despite, evidence that we might be getting enhanced alluviation of bomb peak material and accumulation of the lost carbon. That process detection isn't backed up by long-term changes in the stocks. Now, granted, this isn't the full profile. These horizons go deeper. I invite anyone to try because they're extremely rocky and difficult to work with. But we could be seeing further accumulation lower down. But all this to say, really, that when we consider the iceberg from crest to keel, when we look beyond the branches and explore instead the roots themselves, we find that woodland expansion in this environmental context of ericaceous ecosystems in the Scottish uplands, it's unlikely to make meaningful contributions to carbon sequestration in the soil within 5 decades. And so we would say that its role in Scotland's pathway to net zero should be carefully considered. Thank you very much for listening. We really appreciate you attending, and please feel free to contact me with any questions you might have. Okay, thank you.